Hey there, welcome to our new unit. This unit 2, is going to be focused on leading up to the American Revolution and why it was that we decided to try to get independence, why we were so mad at England, things like that. So our last unit focused on exploration and the setting up of the colonies. Now the colonies have been established and we need to talk about what actually ends up riling them up so much and what are the events that take place leading to the American Revolution. So this week we're going to talk today about salutary neglect and the very first rebellion in the colonies, known as Bacon's Rebellion. And then the next 2 days we're going to spend talking about the French and Indian War, so that you understand that conflict and how it kind of plays a role in the decisions that England makes and then the responses that the colonies make. So I want to start off by just saying, here's what we're doing today. So we're going to go through a very brief set of lecture notes. I will introduce your interactive notebook for Unit 2 to you in tomorrow's lesson. So today's lecture notes are just for you to listen. It's just a little bit of background information, nothing that goes in the interactive notebook. I will tell you, though, that when we start the interactive notebook tomorrow, it is going to be a much more in-depth interactive notebook than your first one was. The first one was kind of like a starter so that you could get an idea of what to do. This one's going to have a lot more stuff that you've got to fill in as we're going along. After that, you've got 2 tasks to complete today. The first one is a pretty fun and pretty easy discussion post, just so that you can demonstrate to me that you understand what salutary neglect is. And then you're going to do an ed puzzle where you learn more about Bacon's Rebellion and the really awful results of the rebellion that take place. And I'm not going to spoil that. You'll learn more about that when you're watching the video. So let's start off by talking about salutary neglect. Salutary comes from the word salutations, which means like you're being nice. Like if you say salutations to somebody, you're like welcoming them and you're saying hello to them. If you neglect something, that means that you're ignoring it. So essentially when we put these 2 words together, salutary neglect means that in this case, the British were being nice and ignoring the laws and the policies that they had put into place. So salutary neglect was when the British unofficially, it's not like they ever wrote this down on paper, but they would create these laws, but then they would kind of like just not enforce them, especially the trade restrictions that were in place. According to the laws of Britain, the British were, and the colonies were only allowed to trade with the British. They weren't supposed to be trading with Spain or with France and stuff like that during the 17th and 18th centuries. However, there wasn't really any enforcement of that, and this trade still kept happening, and the British just kind of turned a blind eye, acted like they didn't see it, and allowed it to continue. The purpose of doing this was to make sure that the colonies would be able to make as much money as possible because, for example, if they are going to trade with the French and the Spanish, then the colonies can make more money. If the colonies make more money, then Britain is making more money. So it was kind of a win-win situation for them because not only did they do that, but it also allowed the colonists to feel like they had some form of control over their own fate and didn't have the king constantly telling them what they could and could not do. So salutary neglect is just the idea that laws were made by England, but then they weren't heavily enforced. That decision in the future is going to change, and we'll talk more about how that changes and how that makes people feel. So about the fact that, let's say that, for example, early on in your school career, it may have been that, teachers were saying like, oh, like, you can't have your cell phones in class. But then when you had it out, they kind of like turned a blind eye, or they would just be like, hey, put your phone away or anything. But then all of a sudden administration comes through and says to all the teachers, we can't do this anymore. We've got to be strict on this law or on this policy in the school. So then all of the teachers came out and were just like, no, you got your phone out, give it to me, I'm turning it in. You got your phone out, give it to me, I'm turning it in. You're getting it right up, you're getting it right up. So all of a sudden this policy that had been in place already for so long, excuse me, wasn't being enforced, but now all of a sudden the school decides to bring the hammer down and enforce it. And you can imagine how something like that would make students feel, that they used to be able to do something and now suddenly they can't, even though technically it was the rule all along. So salutary neglect is kind of the same thing. It's just we're applying this to the colony. So the British would say, like, here's a law that you have to follow, and then not really enforce it. But then all of a sudden they start bringing that hammer down and enforcing it. And it really, really upsets those colonists. So, speaking of being upset, let's take a little turn and talk about an event known as Bacon's Rebellion. You're going to be watching an Ed puzzle on this, so I'm not going to go in deep detail. I just want to give you a little bit of background. So, this rebellion, led by Nathaniel Bacon, is commonly thought of as being the very first armed insurrection by American colonists. And an insurrection is whenever people are trying to basically destroy or bring down the government that is controlling them. So this was the first time that Americans really stood up against the British and their colonial government that was running them. So this happens 100 years before the American Revolution even takes place. And what happened was that Nathaniel Bacon and a group of farmers that were very upset all got themselves armed up and basically went into the colonial capital and decided that they weren't going to take on what the government was making them do anymore, threatened the governor, upended social disorder, burnt the Capitol down to the ground, and just wreaked havoc as a way to say, like, we don't like what's happening. So you're going to learn more in the video about why this happened and the lasting impact that this rebellion actually has. But I did want to go through just a couple little excerpts with you to kind of set the stage. So if you were in class during the Teams meeting, we went through, read this quote, sorry, lost my train of thought there for a second. So read this quote together and then did a waterfall answer about what we think it was saying. So the first one here we're looking at is why were Bacon and others angry? So here's the excerpt that we have, a primary source excerpt. So for having, upon specious pretenses of public works, raised great unjust taxes upon the commonalty for the advancement of private favorites and other sinister ends, but no visible effects in any measure adequate. For not having, during this long time of his government, in any measure advanced this hopeful colony, either by fortifications, towns, or trade. So, what we did as a class was I asked you to look at that quote and then tell me why they are angry. What can you get from that quote as to why Bacon and the other rebels were angry? And the answer here is that there were unjust taxes that were being put into place. So this is usually what everybody sees. They raised great unjust taxes upon the commonality, meaning upon the people. And so basically what they're upset about here is that these taxes were being raised, but then those taxes and the money were being given to the people that they liked, but weren't being given back to the colony to help create the towns, help facilitate trade, help build buildings that they needed. So they're raising all these taxes, but in the end, they're not actually helping the colony out. So that's reason number one that they're angry. Let's look at the next thing. Again, we're going to read this together. Tell me why were they angry? Number two, for having protected, favored, and emboldened the Indians against his majesty's loyal subjects, never contriving, requiring, or appointing any due or proper means of satisfaction for their many invasions, robberies, and murders committed upon us. So again, we did a waterfall question in class. Why were Bacon and others angry? And if we look at this quote, we know that they are angry because they felt like the British were protecting and favoring the Native Americans. You got to remember that we were trying to have a good relationship with Native Americans at this time because we needed to foster trade with them to be able to make money. And so the colonists, though, were like, listen, these savage Indians were constantly attacking us, invading us, robbing us, even at times murdering us. But the British government's doing nothing about that because they don't want to mess up the trade agreement that we have with them. So they're really angry that they feel like the Native Americans are being treated better than they are as English colonials. Last one that we got to look at. This one's a little bit longer. So again, we're looking at why were they angry? For having, when the army of English was just upon the track of those Indians, who now in all places burn, spoil, murder, and when we might with ease have destroyed them, who then were in open hostility, for then having expressly countermanded and sent back our army by passing his word for the peaceable demeanor of the said Indians, who immediately prosecuted their evil intentions, committing horrid murders and robberies in all places, being protected by the said engagement, and word passed of him and the said Sir William Berkeley, who was the governor at the time. So again, another waterfall, took a couple minutes. What exactly were they upset about here? In this instance, you can see they're still upset about what the Native Americans are doing, but this time they're blaming that on the fact that the English army left them. So the English army that could have stopped the Indians from attacking and murdering and robbing the colonists instead was called back to England. And so they sent the English army back, and therefore they removed any protection from the natives. And then once that English army was gone, we see the Native Americans swiftly coming in and taking a lot of that. Now, you got to keep all this in context. This is going to be written from the perspective of these like white colonists. So they're going to be viewing the Native Americans in a very negative form as we are looking at it. So I'm sure that there is much more to this story, and that they just didn't have Native Americans running around and killing people left and right. But we've got to put that into context of the time period. So, but these are the things that they say. This is why we're upset. This is why the rebellion occurs. So I'm going to back away out of this now and then talk to you about what you need to do for your assignments today. So 2 very quick assignments. The first one is a discussion post. I'm going to go into that in a second. The second one is an ed puzzle. I'm not going to go into the ed puzzle. You know at this point how to click on the ed puzzle, watch the ed puzzle, complete the questions. If you finish it and you're not happy with your grade, as always, just let me know and I will gladly come back, and then I will reset your ed puzzle and you can do it again to increase your grade. Your discussion post that you're going to put here, let's get into that. Is that I need to see that you really understand what salutary neglect is. So to get us started in this unit, I want you to do a quick Google image search. You're literally just going to go to Google and put in salutary neglect meme. Find a meme and pick out a picture. So I want you to find a picture. You're going to insert that picture into the discussion. So copy and paste it over. And then it needs to show and demonstrate what salutary neglect is. And then I need you to answer the following questions in that same discussion post. So number 1, knowing the goal of salutary neglect was to increase the loyalty and obedience of the colonists towards England, do you think it was a smart policy for England to adopt? So should they have not, for example, should they have always been enforcing their laws, or was this a smart thing for them to do? Why? Number 2, relate the idea of salutary neglect to a situation in your life, maybe between you and your parents, maybe between you and your teacher. So I want you to come up with a time that you can think of, or even, maybe within US government or another time in US history in which you see an example of like, there's this policy that's supposed to be here, but nobody's enforcing it. And then all of a sudden it gets enforced. Don't use the cell phone example that I used in this lesson. I want you to come up with your own. What is a time where you could have possibly gotten away with something, but then all of a sudden things changed? And then number 3, what do you think is going to happen when the British start to tighten the controls on the colonists? How do you think the colonists are going to respond to that? So you find the meme, you copy and paste it in, and then you give me 3 different answers, submit it, watch your ed puzzle, submit that, let me know if you need anything. As always, I am always here to help you out, and I will see you tomorrow for day 1 of the French and Indian War. Bye, y'all.